Hi, this is Paul. Last week I made this video, a little bit of commentary on Paul Kingsnorth's First Things. That was sort of on the heels of Rod Dreher and Elizabeth Oldfield, their conversation, and also on the heels of Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins. And so I threw that video together. And the video's done fairly well. It's provoked a lot of conversation, which is very good. Jonathan Peugeot followed up on Twitter. I posted a thread on Twitter saying the tensions cannot be ignored, but that is what it is. Tension. Saint Athanasius, who wrote the first hagiography, The Life of Saint Anthony, is also the one who defended homoousios in the Nicene Council, convoked by Constantine. Christianity and civilization cannot be disentangled. It's a question of priority. When we weaponize towards politics, Christianity becomes antichrist. When followed, it yields a holy city. And Jonathan Peugeot says, yes, my last two videos on Lucifer and St. Peter are exactly about this. And they are. And that was some of the tensions that were in Paul Kingsnorth's speech. And, I thought about entitling this. I still don't know what I'm going to entitle this. I usually don't pick a title until after the video's done, because sometimes the contents of a video change as I sit here in front of this strange little camera and ramble. But for me, I got the invitation to the art conference in London, and I still haven't decided whether I'm going to go or not. If I go, I'll probably want to arrange other things to do before and after the conference to make the trip out there worthwhile. But what's so interesting is that this sort of stands so opposite of ARC, and that's about Christian civilization. And so I agree with Peugeot that there's tension here. And because usually what happens is, well, where is Christianity not? And as it turns out, Aaron Wren just did a conversation with Os Guinness, and Os Guinness at the Ark kept talking about the civilizational moment. And so I thought mine might play a little bit to give the other side their due in this. So a little bit of, this is actually the Ark Vision series done by Os Guinness.
I will never forget the day in January 1949 when my dad said to me, "Son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek has abandoned the city and we're at the mercy of the Red Army." And in they came. So I was 2 years under the reign of terror at the beginning of the Chinese Revolution. Thank God that you had these two great revolutions in the 20th century, 1917 and 1949, and the English-speaking people had stood firmly, the West as a whole, against autocracy. And I think that's important today because you can see the rise of looming autocracy, China, Russia, North Korea, and this time, though, the West in considerable confusion and uncertainty.
Now, what on earth do we mean by Christian civilization? That's a big part of this. I mean, few of us will argue that, well, this gets back to a little bit of what was happening in the middle of the 20th century. When you listen to Os Guinness, it almost sounds like, well, Christianity and civilization means democracy. But of course, for most of the history since the birth of Christ, Christian civilization has been monarchical or dictatorial. And so when Os Guinness sort of sets it against autocracy, it's a little hard. And of course, the chapter of Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII with respect to their relations with fascism and Mussolini sort of presses the point. Fairly early on. Some believe that Della Chiesa's departure from the Vatican was the work of Cardinal Raphael Mary del Val, Pope Pius X, Secretary of State, and his main partner in the crusade to stamp out any sign of modernism in the clergy. Pius X worried that modern ideas were replacing the Church's century-old teachings. Particularly noxious in the Pope's views were belief in individual rights and religious freedom, along with the heretical notions that the Church and the state should be separated, and that faith should come to terms with lessons of science. This is the position of the papacy in the early 20th century. The papacy had been beating a long retreat, and by the 20th century, to be a pope meant to be a prisoner of the Vatican. In 1861, Victor Emmanuel II, king of Savoyard state, based in Turin in the northwest, had proclaimed a new kingdom of Italy, having annexed much of the Italian peninsula. Among the territories he acquired by a combination of rebellion and conquest were most of all the lands long ruled by the popes. Only Rome and its hinterlands remained as part of the Papal States. Then in 1870, the Italian army seized Rome as well, declaring it to be the new nation's capital. Pope Pius IX retreated to the Vatican, vowing not to leave its walls until the Papal States were restored. Well, Pope Pius X, Pope Pius XI, Pope Pius XII, Pope Pius XII began to change that, but the popes became prisoners of the Vatican. The Pope excommunicated the king and forbade Catholics to vote in national elections or run as candidates for parliament. He was hoping to gain international support to return Rome to the papal rule. But as the 19th century wore on, this prospect seemed even more remote. A new threat, meanwhile, arose with the rapid growth of the socialist movement. Popes from the time of Pius IX in the mid-19th century had regularly condemned socialism. By 1891, in his famous encyclical Rene Novarum, Pope Leo XIII had charged socialists with working on the poor man's envy of the rich. He blasted their proposal to abolish private property. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Vatican had made clear that socialism was one of the Church's most formidable enemies. With the expansion of the right to vote in Italy in the early 20th century, the Vatican's voting ban became untenable. Unless the Church did something, the socialists would likely come to power. In November 1918, Luigi Sturzo, a Sicilian priest, met with the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, to discuss his plan for a Catholic party, to be called the Italian Popular Party. It would offer a progressive platform intended to lure peasants and workers away from the socialists. It was formally launched early the following year with Benedict XV's blessing. By 1922, it was among the nation's largest. Mussolini begins his career as a socialist, his first publication saying, the title of which was God Does Not Exist. However, he switches sides and becomes a fascist, and then marches to Italy, and the weak Italian monarch, when the general is ready to lock him up, much like Hitler got locked up in that Putsch, I think it was in Hitler's first attempt to gain power. Hitler goes to prison, writes Mein Kampf. Mussolini marches down to Rome, and the king says, I don't know. Okay, just let him. Mussolini grabs power. With the government paralyzed, the king dissolves the parliament and set new elections for May 15, 1921, only a year and a half after the last round. The resulting campaign took place amid an orgy of fascist violence that engulfed the country's northern and central regions, along with scattered areas of the south. The bands, furnished with trucks by agricultural landowners, burned down socialist clubs and union halls and attacked their leaders. In the 5 weeks preceding the 1921 election, 100 people were killed and hundreds more injured. But the socialists kept most of their seats, electing 122, to which could be added 16 elected by the Communist Party, a socialist party faction that had splintered off earlier that year. The Catholic Popular Party, another object of fascist attack, gained seats, electing 107 deputies. Mussolini and the fascists had run in coalition with members of the old conservative elites, most notably with the then Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, who saw the fascists as the bludgeon that he needed to bring the socialists under control. There's a dominant theme in Europe in the 1920s and 30s. Together they won a majority with 275 deputies, including 35 fascists led by Mussolini. Shortly after the new parliament convened, Mussolini rose to give his first speech. it would prove memorable. Hundreds of millions of Catholics throughout the world look to Rome as their spiritual home. He said, "This is the source of strength that Italy could not ignore." Fascism, he pledged, to the shock of many who knew him, would help bring the restoration of Christian society. It would bring a Catholic state befitting a Catholic nation. Mussolini's surprising embrace of the church came without any previous consultation with Vatican authorities. The Catholic Popular Party stood in the way of his efforts to portray himself as the country's best hope for stopping the socialists. To get the Pope to abandon it, he would have to convince him that he could help the church more than the Popular Party could. In November, the fascist movement formally became the Fascist Political Party and adopted a new program. Gone was all the mention of expropriating church property and separating church and state. Trying to enlist Vatican support, Mussolini had his carrot, ending the liberal democratic regime and imposing an authoritarian Catholic state, and his stick. Indeed, he literally did have a stick, the dreaded manganello, the wooden truncheon proudly wielded by the black shirts. From the fascist perspective, the Popular Party was part of the larger network of Catholic institutions in the countryside that stood in their way. At the local level, this obstruction included Catholic action groups, groups of Catholic laymen and women engaged in religious activity under ecclesiastical supervision, and various Catholic cooperatives. The squadristi saw all as fair game for their bloody nighttime raids. In March 1922, priests from the northern region of Mantua sent a letter to the government authorities protesting the fascist beating of local priests and Catholic activists. So then basically the fascists start attacking the Popular Party, which is basically the party that was set up to hopefully bring back influence to the Vatican and Roman Catholic consciousness in Italy. But eventually the Vatican saw the fascists as the better hope, and so then they basically told the Popular Party to dismantle and give the nation to the fascists. Now, of course, this is just one example, and by Vatican II, the whole thing will sweep over again, and by Pope John Paul II, the Vatican will champion democracy. So in the course of less than 100 years, the Vatican will basically turn their ideas around and then support Western democracy. And now, of course, we're going to talk about Christian civilization. Now let's jump in a little bit to Aaron Wren's talk with Os Guinness.
To the camera, people can see what it looks like there, so you know what it is. That's a great cover there. Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time. What is a civilizational moment?
It's a particular thing that needs to be defined carefully. It's not just a crisis. Every civilization rises through some inspiration, dynamic, some deep cause. But at a certain point in the rise, flourishing, and then decline of a civilization loses touch with what made it great. And when that happens, it's not 5 minutes, it might be over a couple of centuries. When that happens, there are only three broad choices: renewal, replacement, or decline. A rather simple way of putting it. Now, of course.
Now, again, when we're talking about civilization, for lack of a better word, we're talking about hyper objects. You cannot look and say, oh, look, a civilization. Civilizations manifest themselves. And I think, as Jonathan Pageau noted, Christianity has been forming civilizations, and Christianity has been critiquing civilizations. I got quite a comment in from the first video. It is not acceptable for you to read a story from the Old Testament in which God asks for the total destruction of a people, including children. That's just sort of struck me because I am a minister and a Protestant one at that, and we do read the Bible and we do have Bible studies. And in fact, I just grabbed those bits from the book of Deuteronomy because I am in fact reading them, and now I learn that this is unacceptable. At least according to this individual. So, well, okay. You will never get your Christian civilization back. Well, here's the slippery part. Have we ever had one? Can we go back to it? But I don't want to be a complete skeptic here, because we all sort of rough draft this thing. We all sort of dead reckon this thing. And again, we might look at A/B testing and say, well, a civilization that does this instead of this, that would be a little bit more Christian civilization than something that maybe does this or doesn't do that. I mean, everybody's sort of got their idea of God or not God or morality or this or that. And it seems that it is mostly men who devote so much of their intellectual mind to preserving that which is archaic. There's a sweeping statement. Many women are devout Christians, but perhaps folk Christianity is blissfully ignorant of all the problems that Christianity has. I would say by virtue of being Christian, most people who identify with Christian probably are quite aware of all of the problems that Christianity has, and sort of coming to terms with that word is difficult because, again, we are dealing with massive, massive things under which so many things may or may not be covered. There's a lot going on outside your purview. I'm sure there is. Sorry for my judgmental tone, but I don't care how much modern Christians will use these Old Testament stories as metaphors for something agreeable and spiritual. It is not necessary to incorporate them at all. But if you take for a moment the idea that, well, if in fact you see, maybe begin a different place. This Jesus who came very much one of the offices with that of the prophetic. And I talked about that in the past, that Jesus had a lot of things to say. And foxes have holes and birds have nests. He's quite likely talking about the perches of the standards that the Roman prize so much, and the holes that Herod just kept building all over the place. Jesus very much inhabited the office of the prophets. People thought he was maybe Elijah. John the Baptist also very much inhabited the office of the prophets, dressing the part and calling out Herods on their marital arrangements, thus winning him the loss of his head. And so again, last week I preached on Elijah, and you have this realization, this tension over, well, what's really going on here? Is this the kingdom of heaven come down to earth? And to the degree that it fails to enact it and embody it, it can be critiqued, and sometimes in a very withering way.
Of course, most civilizations in history declined. They're in ruins. Angkor Wat, the Parthenon, the Colosseum, the Great Pyramid of Giza. They're in ruins or museums or history books. They declined.
And now, again, when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about the fact that, again, it's so easy when we talk about such broad things to sort of default to this monarchical vision where you sort of stand over it and look over it. And I see that right now. Today is Monday. This is Monday afternoon, and tomorrow is the election in the United States. And I'm hearing all sorts of people that are having all sorts of anxiety about what happens Wednesday and Thursday. And whereas, okay, I understand being worried. I understand it's going to be a close election. I understand that sort of the normal routine of having everything happen and then someone will concede the election to the other. That may not happen, and it could happen from either side. I mean, that's just what's just so weird about this. But chances are that the vast majority of Americans are not going to, at least in the next few weeks, and hopefully not in the next number of years, suffer any kind of violence in their home, that there won't be any kind of national disruption. The United States is a very complex, interconnected networks of federal, state, county, local governments, each of which have their own jurisdictions and their own responsibilities. And generally speaking, Most people in a locale don't appreciate rioting because the people who live there lose their property. And these are the people that vote in the district attorney and the sheriff. And no matter what someone's going out and trying to burn something down over, they will send out the district attorney and the sheriff if everything is functioning properly and say, make them stop. If they're unhappy, we have courts and words, and we will use those. And it is certainly my sincere prayer that this is what will happen in the United States. And it is my expectation that this is what will happen in the United States. And if I am proven wrong, well, then I will be way more sad than simply having been proven wrong for the sake of the country.
In our Western world, which is probably the most powerful civilization in history, simply because it's transforming the world and not simply part of the world, we are now at that point today. So that's the civilization.
And so we have these things called civilizations, and they colonize our minds and they colonize our points of view. And we human beings are these astounding creatures that are so intensely programmable that we just see the world in radically different ways. We cannot imagine chimpanzees having civilizations like we do, dogs having civilizations like we do. Nothing we know of has civilizations like we do, where we have radically different views of the world. Someone on Twitter recommended this book to me, Tripping on Utopia by Benjamin Breen, Margaret Mead, The Cold War and the Troubled Birth of Psychedelic Science. I'm just a little bit into the book, but it's colonizing me. This is a very interesting book. I knew almost nothing about Margaret Mead and who she was. But one of the things that's interesting is that so much of the reading from the founding of AA, from Italian politics and papal politics to psychedelics and science happens in those interwar years of the 20s and 30s. Young Margaret Mead first imagined she would live her life like Little Women, have 5 children, get married, and read books and enjoy those things, but eventually she was enamored by the study of anthropology. The pitch worked. Well, the priceless knowledge of thousands of generations, thousands of distinct cultures was being lost, Benedict said. Entire cultures were being mowed down by the violence of colonial empires and flattened further by the homogeneity of modern life. Now, this is a real thing, and this is what Paul was talking about with the ends of worlds. And Paul Kingsnorth was saying that, this has happened throughout history, that worlds end. And we programmable human beings keep getting programmed in different ways and different perspectives. And then one culture supplants another, and you get generations that see the world dramatically differently. I've been reading some books about Christian Reform history, and the truth is that I see the world dramatically differently than my grandparents did. And I bear the same last name, and I go to the same church. And I wasn't in any way deemed a rebel in my youth, but I remember visiting my grandparents when I was a college kid and talking to them about how they viewed the world. They lived in a very different world than I did. And anthropology was the study of all of this. Every day that passed was a day in which an ancient language or a unique artistic tradition might disappear. Again, this is in the 20s, and a lot of things are happening. Cultural anthropology was not about collecting dead relics to gather dust in museums. It was about salvaging the distilled knowledge of millions of lives, hard-won lessons that might one day help shape humanity's collective future. The pitch worked. After Mead married Cressman in September 1923, she spent the night of her honeymoon writing a seminar paper for Boaz's class. Anthropology had to be done now, Mead decided. Other things could wait. Mead's father, a professor at Penn, was predicting a second global war by 1939. From the moment she accepted Ruth Benedict's offer, Mead wrote, "I was to be single-minded, trying to do as much field work as possible before the next war." The urgency of what she saw as this precious window, this period of 15 or so years in which to perform what later scholars would call savage anthropology, yielded an obsessive focus. Even the political upheaval of the Depression and later of the Spanish War went, in a sense, unnoticed. She said, "For I was living in a time perspective of 100 years, and perhaps the materials with which we would hopefully be prepared for that long future." And again, you could see that building up to her, of course, is Christianity. Christianity with its sort of egalitarian, Christianity both yields hierarchy and equality with this. These are image bearers of God, and there must be some value to their culture, so we should at least study it. Because, even remember that when the conquistadors came over, it was the Spanish missionaries that, in many ways, gave us the notes preserving what we know of the culture in the Americas. Same thing happened with the Vikings. Christianity, on one hand, is part of these cultures that sort of steamroll the world, but it's also part of the culture that sees these relics and says, well, they at least ought to be preserved and studied. And even before a phrase like common grace is recognized, maybe there's something of God's goodness via general revelation in these cultures that are dying and being supplanted. And in many cases, being supplanted by people willingly because they see the other culture as superior to the one that they have inherited. Kind of, maybe, sort of. Of course, I haven't yet gotten around to read the book that Paul Kingsnorth was talking about the Indian who converted. That was a very common story in the 19th century. In other words, when Mead earned her master's degree in anthropology in 1924, she had more than one audience in mind. This work was not just for the people of her time. This was for the people that would inhabit that long future. Benedict saw the study of culture as a way of moving beyond racism, beyond the dangerous myth of blood. Now remember, 1920s, 1930s, eugenics is extremely popular. Social Darwinism is very popular. Now, part of what happens is that entire aspect of evolution gets memory holed by the Second World War. Though this view would become commonplace after the Second World War, it was radical in its time. If human nature was a book, then nearly everyone up to that point had been seeing only a single page, the culture into which they were born. Benedict and Mead wanted to read the whole thing. The purpose of anthropology, Benedict once said, is to make the world safe for human differences. Pluralism is going to rush in. By studying radically different cultures, the anthropologist could access a vast laboratory of social forms. Now, again, you sort of see a monarchical vision. We're going to stand apart from these cultures and look at them scientifically because this is the way that we can see them objectively. And you have all this language of modernity coming in. But crucially, this was not a laboratory in which the scientist was an impartial observer, staring down into sterile test tubes. Scientists, after all, were part of the cultures they studied, moving in the world rather than outside it. Benedict and Mead were not just trying to understand such things as deviance or altered states of consciousness in other societies, other lives. They were trying to understand themselves. Like Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead saw anthropology as a hunt for the hidden patterns that shaped our lives. But unlike her mentor and lover, she would come to see this work as part of something that extended beyond science, a project that was part of an epic story of humanity's transformation into a species capable of reshaping its destiny. Bosey, anthropologists, had de-centered the Western sense of self. You've got all this postmodern. You can see the impact of postmodernity into all this language, the decentering of the self. But of course, implicit in it was all this monarchical vision thinking. This new kind of consciousness of humanity's complexity, as Mead put it, allowed humans to guide the evolution of our societies into a self-aware fashion. Now here we have, sort of the innocence of the self. If we're self-aware, of course we'll pick the good. If we're masters of the universe, of course we'll arrange it for the better. aiming intentionally for the creation of a more peaceful, more tolerant social order. This was nothing less than a science of expanded consciousness, an explicitly utopian project of species-wide uplift. Margaret Mead became a scientist in 1923. Within 3 years, she was already well on her way to being a famous scientist. It seemed to happen almost effortlessly. She just happened to be good at talking, and the press happened to enjoy listening to her. In the fall of 1926, for instance, she had even published her finding from her fieldwork in Samoa, a New York Times article announcing her work to the world under the eye-catching headline, "Scientist Goes on Jungle Flapper Hunt." Mead's chosen topic of female adolescence in a traditional society turned out to be perfectly tuned to the interest of the 1920s America that was quickly becoming dominated by young people. The word teenager had been coined just 2 years before, and I bet you thought teenager was an eternal word, didn't you? 2 years before Mead reached Samoa, best-selling novels like Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt chronicled a modern form of family in which alienated partners presided over children who hid their anxieties behind the gloss of consumer culture. Against this backdrop, Mead's Samoan youths stood out. Carefree, mentally healthy, sexually active, and unburdened by adolescent angst. Boy, you could try selling that today and say, see? What's interesting, of course, is that, some of these people live in Sacramento, and for a while, we were renting to a Samoan church. We stopped renting to them because they never quite got the idea that rent was something that should be paid. So as is usually the case, Livingstones went for months, giving them free space without ever being paid. And in the end, we stopped opening the door for them and they couldn't understand it. But I remember the pastor of that church, he would come into my office and we'd have conversations and he would tell me how every year he would bring his kids back there, place he grew up. His parents were still there. And for him, it was an idyllic lifestyle. If you wanted breakfast, you just reach out and take the fruit off the tree, and you sleep at night with there's no windows. It's not an enclosed place, and the beautiful island breezes. It sounds absolutely idyllic and lovely. But he says, I bring my kids back there, and they want breakfast cereal and television. What people consider idyllic is just as programmable as everything else. But the whole point of, let's say, this entire movement behind Jordan Peterson is that maybe it isn't just completely programmable. Maybe it isn't just simply arbitrary. Because people who want to say, well, everything's just a social construct, well, then all the A/B testing we try to do to sort of dead reckon good and bad and right and wrong, well, that all falls apart because there is no good and bad. It's just everything's a social construct. Against this backdrop, Mead's Samoan youth stood out, carefree, mentally healthy, sexually active, unburdened by adolescent angst. They offered not just a contrast to the social structure of the West, but a self-evidently superior alternative. You can already feel the Christian civilizational lions of the 19th century beginning to transform into foxes. And if you don't know what I mean by lions and foxes, look at the video. Maybe I can pull it up. I want to read something. Let's see if I have it on my Kindle or if I have to pull it up on my computer. Eric Torenberg, I read this on the plane flying over from Frankfurt to Heathrow. Aaron Torenberg had a good post on his Substack on group narcissism. Goes over some. No. Just sign in. Hang on. So obviously I'm not all set up here to put this on the screen, so I'm just going to read it. You're going to have to listen to it, and I'll put the link to the Substack below. John Cudahy was a sociologist who tried to make sense of how America was unique in its ability to assimilate so many groups so successfully, when so many other regions of the world were caught up in endless ethnic conflict. Cudahy's model was that the United States civil religion, by which he means the religion of civility, has always had high WASP values and virtues, impeccable manners, premium on education, work ethic, etc. And each new generation of immigrants for generations understood that if they wanted to rise to the top of American social hierarchy, they needed to adopt that civil religion, which was to say those WASP values. And this is how the American elite assimilation engine rolled more or less happily for 200 years. But then sometime between the 1950s and the 1970s, the high WASP collective decided to abandon the old rightist aristocratic model and turn into a more progressive model. They kept doing all the same things, sending their kids to Harvard, passing along multi-generational wealth and all the rest, but started believing like they were no different from the rest of society, and downplaying the habits and behaviors that led to their success. Now, this doesn't say here, but I think a lot of that has to do with the counterculture, because the counterculture was, it's an ironic populist movement, but was a populist movement that basically shamed the country club people and all of these elite things that only they could have. And remember, the country clubs kept out Catholics and Jews and blacks and all of this waspy stuff. That's where WASP comes from. And shamed it out of them as basically not in keeping with their egalitarian Protestant Christianity, and rightfully so. But there's a consequence to this. They kept on doing these things, sending their kids to Harvard, passing along multi-generational wealth and all the rest, but started believing they were no different from the rest of society and downplaying the habits and behaviors that led to their success. This is the Machiavelli Pareto model we've discussed, and there's a link to it in the thing. The aristocracy, which once ruled through the confidence, competence, and force, over time denigrates into an oligarchy of manipulation, cunning, and deceit. Now, this is super interesting because one of the panels had Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who of course has this very interesting message that she loves to give, that the West should be more confident in its liberalism and enforce it, and basically not, of course she lives in the Netherlands, not let all of this Islam that is coming into,
she lives in California,
Western Europe get root. You need to assimilate those people into the core Western values. In order for that to happen, Westerners need to be confident in their values. A lot of the conference is about getting back that confidence. That's what this conference is really about, at least day one so far. I'll read a little bit more from this quote. Pareto called this the aristocracy of lions versus the aristocracy of foxes. Lions are proud, forceful aristocrats who explicitly own their position as leaders. Foxes, however, are humble servants who will forever deny that they're in charge. While lions want to run the world, foxes want to save the world. Because our new elites are foxes and not lions, they no longer feel comfortable celebrating productive habits for the rest of society. And this is the point that I've made often.
So I'll put the link to that video below, but that's the reference to lions and foxes, because, well, in many ways, so you look at Kingsnorth. If you read it's unacceptable to read the Old Testament. Well, there's a demand to, hey, fox, stay in your place, fox. Don't be reading the most published book in all of human history. Don't read that book. Oh, I thought we were an open society, but don't read it in public. Oh, and of course, Jesus. Boy, he is the sneakiest smuggler of all. Jesus has smuggled and infiltrated. And so when these anthropologists are going all around the world looking for new societies that have not been yet touched by Jesus, they're like, oh. And so at least Mead claimed in her book, The Coming of the Age in Samoa in 1928, which was an immediate bestseller. Frank Boas summed up her argument in the book's foreword. What constitutes courtesy, modesty, very good manners, and definite ethical standards is not universal. It is instructive to know that standards differ in the most unexpected ways. The modesty part of Boas's formulation was key.
Mead's work implied, with unusual frankness, that the sexual norms of the 1920s America were merely one manifestation of sexuality among many possible and preferable alternatives. In the aftermath of her Samoan success, Mead sailed easily into a career as a public intellectual. She wrote brilliantly with enormous quantities, seemingly on any topic that came to mind, and she cultivated a persona that would with time become iconic. With her close-cropped hair, youthful demeanor, unconventional clothes, the young Margaret Mead had something of the air of Amelia Earhart. She had a personal life that was nearly as complicated as those of the silent film stars that the newspapers of the 1920s fawned over. In 1926, while traveling via steamship from Australia to France, where Luther Cressman awaited her, Mead fell in love with a young anthropologist from New Zealand called Reno Fortune. What a name! Lanky, overtly masculine, and almost cartoonishly brooding, Fortune was the gentle Cressman's opposite. Now remember, she's also falling in love with women, so she's bi and she's divorcing and remarrying and having love affairs, and she is the contemporary woman in the 1920s, and you can begin to see all of these things coming into play.
Moment. Now, in terms of the West, clearly it was the Christian faith that made the West. So we owe a lot to the Greeks, something to the Romans, but it was the conversion of the barbarian tribes in Europe that made the West. And of course, most of the West has repudiated the Christian faith, certainly at the level of the intelligentsia, and Enlightenment secularism has failed to be a replacement. That's why.
And this is part of what makes these conversations so difficult, is these terms are so large. Now, if you listen to Moraz Guiness, like I haven't the gospel seminar is not yet out, but you'll hear him plenty of times in the Exodus seminar, talking about the values of Western liberal democracy, which are heirs of the Enlightenment. And, well, let's go, let me go a little bit more.
We're at this civilizational moment.
What are some examples of previous civilizational moments so people can get a sense of what we're talking about?
Well, the two best known for people in the West, and certainly for Christians in the West, you can see first in the Bible, and then in the story of Rome. So the period of the late time before the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem in 587, 586, when prophets like Jeremiah were writing, that's a good example of a time, because what made Israel was repudiated, and they went to it.
Now, that's a very interesting example because, of course, the prophetic role of Isaiah has Isaiah 5, this wonderful parable of the garden. You have Jeremiah, you have the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. You have the prophets coming and saying, not unlike Paul Kingsnorth, you have lost the way. But the prophets are pointing back to that book that I guess I'm not supposed to read publicly, Deuteronomy, and saying, this is the way. Deuteronomy is a map of civilization. You have left the map of civilization. Now, you could just see the going back and forth between this. And so, to a degree, I agree with Os Guinness that you have these moments where there's a crisis in the civilization and they're trying to figure out, okay, which way do we go? Now, what we've had, obviously, for the last 100 years are globalization has been more and more prevalent because now, and globalization brings with it pluralism, and pluralism is a challenge to any coherent civilization. But in order for someone to have a world, that world needs a degree of coherence, and even if someone sort of talks about being open to this and open to that, well, one must choose a way to live.
Exile. And then, of course, you have really the 5th century, and the great writer there is St. Augustine, describing the decline of pagan Rome and another civilization that met its end in that way. So those two periods are pretty well known.
You can go back again in the Rest is History archives and find an episode on the question, when does Rome fall? And it's actually a difficult question because one might argue Latin Christendom, which is sort of the broadest sense of the West, did Rome really fall? Well, certain things ended and certain things supplanted them. But there's always a degree of, if you look at, let's say, the United States, in many ways, much in the United States is sort of patterned after Rome, partly because the founding fathers of the United States were deists, Christian deists, classicists. And, well, then you get into this very common conversation here now. Well, what do you really mean by this word Christian? Because there seem to be so many of them. So the Samoans that met in my church, they were certainly Christians. They were Methodists. They sang songs and they had communion and they had sermons, and yet the pastor of the church bemoaned the fact that his children, when they visited the beautiful island that they came from, wanted to eat Captain Crunch. He might have degenerated into a serial killer, Cereal.
Of course, when you go back to the Sumerians and the Babylonians, the Egyptians, really only scholars know that. But the other two, we can know.
It's interesting you bring up Israel at the time of the exile, because I've just been reading Jeremiah. That's the book of the Bible that I'm going through right now, and he's quite graphic prophecies about what is about to happen to them. If we think about Rome, it sounds like you're saying sort of Rome failed and then Europe emerged as a new thing. So I want to clarify. Rome didn't essentially find Christianity and reinvented itself. It sort of died and then a new Western civilization sprang in its place. Or how do you interpret that transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages?
Now, Rome, in terms of the Western Empire, declined and fell, and people say somewhere around 476, and that sort of a period. Of course, Rome itself had moved to Constantinople, and you have the Byzantine Empire, which lasted another 1,000 years. But Rome, as we know it in terms of the Western Empire, clearly collapsed.
In terms of our society, how did we
I don't think it's anywhere near that clear.
get to this civilizational moment? What caused Christianity to sort of lose its purchase on society?
Well, I think the rise of secularism in its 18th century Enlightenment form, which they summed up in one word as reason. But you can see a number of different impulses behind it. The first one, we don't want God. In other words, a key part of European secularization is revulsion against established and oppressive state churches. So you have the French Revolution most clearly, but the cry of Diderot, which is picked up by the Jacobins, we will never be free until we strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. In other words, much of Enlightenment reason was a parasite on the best of Christian beliefs, but a protest against the worst of Christian behavior. And certainly, my family's Irish. If you look at the sad story of the incredibly rapid secularization in Ireland in the last generation, much of it is against the backdrop of the corruption of the church, which is incredibly sad. The evidence from the orphanages and so on.
Now, there's no end to that discussion because, of course, well, he's paying attention to the collapse of the Catholic Church in Ireland. He's not paying attention to the tensions between England and Ireland that went on for how long? Again, that's a lot of history I didn't know, but listening to the rest of history, it's like, wow. Part of what shaped the 20th century was, on one hand, England wanted to maintain its empire. On the other hand, the 19th and 20th century, on the other hand, it had to deal with what are we going to do with the Irish? And so I've talked a lot about secularism. I think in many ways, secularism arises out of sort of a Christian. Secularism arises out of agreements between Christians to sort of dead reckon goodness within their frames as best as they can. And in that way, as I've argued before, sort of following Tom Holland, part of what happens is Christianity gets brought all over the world in sort of a weakened form through secularism. Secularism is itself laden with Christianity. And as is democracy, as is so many of these institutions that we simply are so ubiquitous and common among us, that the whole question of this definition of what we believe religion to be is something different. And again, often Christians want to sort of peg this on God. Probably my biggest but to Justin Brierley's book and his efforts with his podcast is what happens in the Cold War 20th century is that Christians, even though church attendance is reaching its peak, Christians try to keep upping the stakes on sort of the when you look at, say, how much moisture can the air hold? Well, that's a function of temperature. When air gets colder, air can hold less moisture. When air gets warmer, air can hold more moisture. During the Cold War, we had very warm air, and it was holding a lot of Christian moisture, meaning these were the top rates of people going to church in the United States. I've sort of got the cold-hot thing inverted. But after the Cold War, the temperature comes down and people start dropping out of church and they get condensation on the windows. But again, if you look at Nathan Jacobs' work, they don't just stop believing in anything.
Not just about God, but, about ghosts, about the soul, about the paranormal generally, that sort of thing. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at the non-affiliated, they actually have a host of broadly spiritual beliefs that don't fit into that materialist worldview. So the majority of the nuns, many of them profess belief in karma or fate. We'll talk about that in greater detail. Most of them consider themselves to be spiritual in some sense. Again, something we'll talk about. But also, just in terms of the broad paranormal, this is something that was rather interesting. More than 90% of them believe in ghosts or spirits. Notice that I said 90% are not atheists, 10% are atheists, but more than 90% believes in ghosts or some spirits. What that means is that some of the self-identified atheists still believe in ghosts and spirits. Now, that may sound utterly bizarre, but I actually encountered this firsthand. So I had mentioned that, only a few people, only, 2 in number, actually identified as atheists in my pre-screening of the nuns. One of the stories about this exposed me exactly to this exact issue. So there was this couple that I was interviewing. I really liked them. I wanted to have them in the documentary, but it didn't really work out. But they were from New York. And I was talking to them, husband and wife. They'd been married for about 3 years. And I was going through my usual questions, right? Were you raised religious? Okay. If you were both parents religious? Did they practice? Things like that. And I finally got to the question about whether or not they believe in God or a higher power. And the husband said, absolutely. And the wife said, absolutely not. Now, what was shocking is they also looked at each other and said, you do? You don't? Right? And all of a sudden I realized they had never talked about whether God exists. They were married, had been married for 3 years, and somehow that topic had never come up. Anyway, be that as it may, what was interesting is that the wife in this couple was talking about, I don't believe in God, science, science, science. But then suddenly, my apartment is haunted. And she started talking about how, there's weird stuff, paranormal stuff that happens in their apartment. She started talking about ghost hunter shows and how she's super into it, and all the rest. And so it was bizarre, right? She didn't believe in God, but she did believe in ghosts or spirits or something like that. And so that was interesting. That was my initial exposure to that phenomenon. And I found this was not something that was unique to me, right? I had found that a lot of the non-affiliated, most of them were into the paranormal. They were intrigued by the paranormal. They believed in ghosts, things like that. And as I said, even some of the atheists, right, like this woman, believed in ghosts. Pew had found the same thing. And actually, there was a sociologist, Clay Rutledge, who had studied this as well. And Clay Rutledge, as well as Pew, had really found that the non-affiliated not only have a tendency to embrace the paranormal and believe in it, but they're actually more likely than religious people to believe in it. So again, the point here is really to say that if the narrative, even if the worry, right, that some Christians had, or the new atheists, the narrative that they have, were true, right? If it were that there's this debate going on between, the atheists and the theists, and the atheists are winning, then what you would see amongst the nuns is actually the type of materialist worldview that you have amongst the atheists in that side of the discussion. But that's not at all what you have. So that's not what's happening.
Now, again, the entire video is excellent. The link will be below. I very much recommend watching it. I'm going to probably keep feeding it from it for a while. And so this narrative that, well, people gave up belief in God. Oh, okay. But I think secularism was finally much more that broadly Christian people who many of whom did not want to go to church, did not want to be affiliated with an institution that told them what to believe. And even if they were believing whatever they wanted to anyway, but sort of making things work with those that were in it. But they roughly saw the world the same. And a lot of that has been moving. But the thing is, coalitions continue to arise. People are intensely practical. And I know that there's a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen after the election. I'm not saying bad things can't happen. Bad things always do happen eventually. The United States, if the Lord tarries, will not last forever. It simply won't. Civilizations end. But these deep things remain. I mean, you can see that with, the United States conquered Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and we're going to bring democracy. Good luck. It's way, way more complex than that. So Christianity is already in the mix, and what people like, what people think are good and bad, this is going to bubble up into the process. And what tends to happen in a democratic system, we see this, let's say, with the debate around abortion. Many Christians will say, zero tolerance, this is it. American public opinion on abortion hasn't changed much for a very long time. They don't want complete bans on abortion, but they want abortion controlled. And, well, what does that say about the culture? Is the culture Christian? That's one of these sentences that you can't live without, but you can never fully sort of answer it. And maybe that's enough for this video. It's about time that I wrap things up. The dog is getting itchy, wanting to get out of here. And leave a comment. Tell me what you think.